Hello, good morning. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I think we might be coming in dribs and drabs now, but that's okay. Good morning. It's really nice to see you all at our next open space event. I'm Marianne. I will be hosting and facilitating the event today as the sector development coordinator. Our event today is on ethics and theatre from lived experience. We have three brilliant speakers who are going to speak about their perspectives on this topic and issue. And what I'm going to do now is just share my screen and have a little overview of the event. We are recording this first half of the event, as the presentations and the Q&A will go up onto our YouTube afterwards. So if you want to, you can turn your cameras off, whatever you're comfortable with. Let me share my screen now. If I can find it. So this is today's event. Slideshow. Hopefully everyone can see that. Our calling question for today is, what are the ethical considerations when making theatre from lived experience? So that is the question that we sent out to all our speakers, along with some ideas for talking points from feedback from previous events we've run under the Centre for Excellence, as this topic came from a workshop that myself and Sarah led in January on the practical side of theatre from lived experience in an open playground event where we brought games and activities to experiment with. And in that session, a lot of us talked about the ethics of this practice, and the feedback was, can we talk about it more? So that is why we're here this morning. So we have three presentations in the first half today. First up, we'll have Amanda Huxtable. Amanda is a writer, director, producer, and mentor. Current project is co-director at Vanitas Arts, which are a company specialising in digital storytelling. We'll then hear from Aidan, who is the Radical Makers course director at Collective Encounters, which is a training programme for emerging artists in Merseyside. Aidan will be speaking about the findings from his recent MRes, and we're very lucky. Aidan is, I understand, in the middle of writing up to submit, so we're lucky Aidan is here this morning to talk about that, hot off the press. And finally, we'll have a recorded presentation from Michelle Richards, who is a drama therapist and freelance theatre practitioner, and she'll be talking about her experience on the Where You're At programme, which is working with people with experience of migration. So that's our first half. After our presentations, we will have a Q&A with all the panelists, and then we'll move on to the open space in the second half. So we'll name our rooms based on the discussions that you've had in the Q&A and what you've heard from the provocations from our speakers. So get thinking about what sparks are flying when you hear their presentations. If you have questions, please pop them in the chat. We'll be monitoring that throughout for when we get onto the Q&A. I hope that all makes sense. I'm going to stop sharing now. And I'm going to welcome Amanda to start your provocation.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to make an adjustment here. So I'm reading something in my presentation. Can you see anything else? Let me see. 2 seconds. Lovely. Okay. So my name is Amanda Huxtable. I'm a black working class woman based in Yorkshire. I'm a director and producer and writer for Vanitas Arts. And as Marianne kindly said, we produce work with digital practice in mind, including audio drama, immersive theatre, and we're a partner at Geo Stories, a story app where you can access and listen to location-based story by either visiting the location or staying at home whilst engaging with the story-placed AR. So I've been asked to consider the ethics of theatre and lived life experiences. As ever, I have more questions than answers, and I will share my thoughts using a selection of work that I've been making with fellow artists.
Can I cut in, because I can't really hear you, and I think other people are finding that too. Have you got your microphone covered?
Let me check. Can you hear me now?
Slightly better.
That's
wow. Okay, let me just check. Let me move that up. How's that?
Better, but not great.
Right.
Have you got a microphone volume?
Yes, and I've moved that up.
Okay, well, it's better. It's better than it was. Thank you.
Thank you. How's that for you, Marianne?
Yeah, that's better.
I'll shout, make sure I'm heard.
Perfect.
Okay. Unusual for me, Aidan, not to be heard, isn't it? Right, let me continue. So my first thoughts on ethics went to the word itself. I heard the word ethics and was immediately reminded that our current serving Prime Minister has had not one, but two ethics advisors resign in less than 2 years. Both felt it necessary to leave their crucial posts and leave the government to carry on with whatever was causing them concern, to resign. Thank you for the invitation to speak briefly on the subject of ethical considerations within theatre making, which thankfully has slightly less consequences for our country. But please note, I've only said slightly less impact, as any question of a lack of ethics taken to its extremes has grave consequences. I made the assumption that amongst us here at Collective Encounters is an organisation that may attract people who are deeply concerned about ethical questions related to our country and our everyday lives. I imagine many in the room here today on this Zoom call, because of our nature of our possible collective interests, are on high alert as to what these resignations could mean for our country. However, although I'm in the business of imagination, I'm not in the habit of assumptions, and I look forward to hearing your questions later after my fellow speakers have shared their thoughts today. The work without ethics. The word ethics have provoked thoughts of boundaries, limits, protection, the creation of safer spaces, and just what does unethical theatre look like. It does not matter where the money comes from. It does not matter if anyone gets paid. It does not matter if we tell stories that harm vulnerable people and communities. Anyone can play anyone. An all-male cast of The Colour Purple, for example. An all-white cast of The Wiz. Here are some examples of the work that I've made. So here we have, when you're not thinking about lived life experiences of real lived people, we have a blank page and a blank canvas for all of us who've told stories. But do we still have a ethical responsibility to those imaginary stories? I believe we do. So as opposed to the lived experience or the imagined experience, we still have responsibilities. Mary Seacole, this is a whistle-stop tour, I only have minutes to go. So Mary Seacole for us was a really interesting conversation regarding social history and looking after the black female narrative within that social historical context. Mary Seacole had her own flaws, everybody does. And the piece that we made was called The Yellow Doctress, which has its own problems, talking about the colorism that Mary certainly perpetuated and pushed forward in her own life, but also trying to protect the story that happened for her as a black woman, as opposed to Florence Nightingale. It's a bigger story that I don't have time to tell now, but it made us really consider how we protect her story but tell the truth of her experience. I've placed Rosa Parks here because it was a really interesting conversation talking about law breaking and activism. you place Rosa Parks in this story, then clearly our world has placed this, this lawbreaker as someone to really be excited and celebrated. However, some people would say otherwise. When we went deeper into the work, we shared this first, which was obviously Rosa Parks' fingerprints. The next place and consideration for me, this work is by Tayo Aluko. It's called An Ordinary Lawyer and was a celebration of Tunji Sawande, the first black judge in the UK. Our considerations here was that he had a living relatives in this country, Liverpool, and that we had to ensure that we consulted regarding this real person's life. Here we have Everything I Own, written by Daniel Ward, that was written in the middle of the pandemic. This piece was really exploring the loss and grief of black men in the UK. We consulted with black men in the UK, mainly in Hull, while we made this work, to ensure that our practice and our thoughts and considerations had them in the centre of that conversation. I've shared here a piece by Leanna Benjamin, a black disabled woman based in Leeds, and it was called Unknown. The subject matter was her voice, her story, and it was very important that she had close contact to the rehearsal room and was able to move the story alongside myself as a director. This piece is by ourselves at Vanitas Arts, and is about a woman called Dr. Mary Mcleod Bethune. It was an audio drama, and we were very interested in what happens with the narrative of public service and real life experiences. There are some of the communities that do not want to hear the real life experiences. For example, Martin Luther King and what he may or may not have been up to, because apparently it degrades and takes away from their activism, but lives have been lived. Finally, in terms of the examples that I'm sharing with you today, Vanitas Arts have recently rehearsed and recorded, written a series of audio dramas related to real life experiences, and also putting in imaginary possibilities. We have here Ken Snake Hips Johnson, who lived in London in the 1940s, Josephine Baker, who we particularly were interested in her Parisian experiences, Gladys Bentley, who was described by Langston Hughes as being the Harlem Renaissance, and Ada Bricktop Smith, who ran an extraordinary club in the Paris 1926. Taking care of their lives and ensuring that they're heard and known is part of our remit. But the ethics of that in terms of protecting, in terms of self-descriptors, and so, for example, Gladys Bentley lived as a drag king. There's been lots of conversations about what else may have happened, but we went to the research of people's own personal descriptors and stuck with that. So it has been a whistle-stop tour, and I apologise for the first beginning of not being able to hear me, but hopefully you've heard me clearly up to this point. I'm going to stop at that point now because I only have a brief moment, but thank you for listening.
I am hard of hearing, Amanda, so if you could slow down slightly, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you for letting me know.
Thank you, Amanda, for that. I think that's a really great question, not only about how we approach ethical theatre making with people around us now, but in consideration of history and Black history and those complex relationships there, and who you have a responsibility to when telling those stories. I've written down the phrase "looking after," which I think is a really lovely way of summing up that care that you approach your work with. So thank you very much. We're going to move on to hear from Aidan next. If you have any questions for Amanda or Aidan or anything that's coming up, please do pop them in the chat throughout, and we'll get to them at the Q&A at the end. Okay, I'm just going to spotlight you, Aidan.
Thank you. So firstly, can everybody hear me okay? And if there's any problems, just try and make sure that you get Marianne's attention or mine. I'll also try to speak slowly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pose a provocation about the limits of working with lived experience. And this provocation is based on research that we're currently finishing with a group of long-term collective encounters participants. We've spent 18 months working with them on this topic. The research is in an academic context, so I have references. I'm going to refer to some writers. I can make those available at the end, or Marianne can share the document. So in the practice of theatre for social change, or even just applied theatre generally, it is easy, I think, to romanticize and even canonize the participants and the meaning of their experiences. But in fact, I'm going to suggest that that can be a problem. So direct lived experience doesn't have a universal perspective necessarily. By its nature, it's often situated or local to a particular community or a place. And participants might have experience of oppression in a given context, but that can be framed in narrow terms and obviously can contain biases, prejudices, racist or gendered perspectives, for example. It can be ahistorical, in other words, uninformed by things that have happened in the past. And that is there's a big argument going on at the moment about things that are deemed to have happened in the past. And in fact, some narratives can be completely mythologized. So there's no reason why lived experience is necessarily progressive if we were hoping it might be. Hilary Wainwright has spent time looking at this idea of lived experience, and she refers to it as tacit knowledge. And she argues it's not necessarily collective or what she calls socialized. Tacit or socialized knowledge used to be central to the way that we knew the world. But the Enlightenment caused an enclosure of knowledge, if you like. There's some great writers on this. If anyone's read Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici, I recommend that, and there are others. And this enclosure of knowledge took the idea that we could know things about our own world in our own way, away from female-centered community knowledge into patriarchal institutions such as universities and established religion. So the Enlightenment had the effect of downgrading the status of what people knew for themselves. Wainwright goes on to argue and, well, to point out really that this idea of tacit knowledge was also appropriated by the free market guru Friedrich Hayek to justify the idea of the free market, in that he argued that the free market was the only mechanism for coordinating individual entrepreneurial knowledge that he said could not be written down or centrally organized. So what we've got here is the common sense of the individual being set against the common sense of the group. And as Wainwright points out, which group it is matters. So socialized tacit knowledge comes out or is embodied in the practice of social movements. And Hilary Wainwright uses the example of grassroots women's organizations or radical unions. Another problem, I think, with lived experience or community-centered knowledge is that it is embedded in communities which are often under attack. And this kind of knowledge needs to be constantly renewed to thrive. So it's vulnerable to destruction by processes like hypergentrification or to erasure by people with power. But it's also vulnerable to more subtle incorporation by ideologies that come from ruling class or nationalist agendas. So, for example, Satnam Virdi has argued that the history of the English working class is also that of race. You can't have one without the other. Some working class experience is formed by whether those to be perceived to be leaders at a given time or place are nationalists, drawing on a narrow patriotism, or internationalist, linking in with struggles around the world. And the narrow patriots have too often included people who say they speak for the working class, from trade union leaders and the Labour Party to the far right. And this, of course, affects many of the kinds of communities that Theatre for Social Change and people working with lived experience wish to reach out to. So what other limits are there? Well, another problem, as Donald Rumsfeld put it, not often you get him in a quote in this context. If people aren't aware of this quote, I'll come back to that later, but he famously was worried about the unknown unknowns. That is, that which we do not know, and we don't know that we don't know it. And Paul Gilroy has described this as groomed ignorance and has shown how this is a deliberate strategy of miseducation in which governments cultivate a deficit of information on Europe's colonial past. That's his quote, that last bit. So there's a requirement working with participants to place tacit knowledge in a critical context that recognizes that no knowledge is neutral. And as Henry Giroux put it, historical amnesia has become the hallmark of the politics of the new right. We can forget about Rosa Parks, you know, and we can move on. That was actions committed in the past, as the American right put it. It's not important now. That's historical amnesia. So if Theatre for Social Change can't be neutral, nor can its practitioners, because there is no neutral. So I'm going to suggest we have to be militant instead, in a very specific sense that was proposed by the activist and researcher Jeffrey Juris, who is sadly no longer with us. And in the context of Theatre for Social Change or emancipatory research, we need to be honest about how we align with this idea of socialized tacit knowledge. And that in sharing this, we play a role in the transformation of communities in struggle into communities of resistance. And Wainwright calls this, in the context of self-organization, she refers to this as the power as transformative capacity instead of power over people. So we have to be activists within movements, not external observers. Otherwise, we run the risk of being the shock troops of gentrification. And I imagine that most of us here are familiar with the way arts projects can encroach on marginalized communities as part of regeneration projects. And time and again, these projects inflict massive change on areas, wiping out communities while they extract and celebrate histories, or as I like to put it, they turn wisdom into wasdom. I'm going to finish off now by thinking about a few things we can do about this. I think artists have to be embedded in the communities in which the participants are present. We must be prepared to be in deep relationship with our participants. Trust can only be built over time and long-term engagement. And then when that trust has been built up, it's possible to engage in this critical discussion with people, and it's possible to be militant and align ourselves with the people that we're working with. And how do we counter groomed ignorance and historical amnesia whilst valuing and honouring the lived experience? Well, firstly, we can't exempt ourselves from this. So, for example, I have degree-level groomed ignorance. I have a responsibility to change this. And as I said earlier, part of the process of change involves taking our time with people, but another part of this is asking questions. And there are well-tried methodologies from the world that do this. So to finish off, I'm going to suggest one as a starting point, which is that we must explore the principles of the Brazilian popular education movement, starting with the work of Paulo Freire. In this framework, we can be critical, militant, questioning, humble, and open to learning. And to quote Freire, we become jointly responsible for a process in which all grow. In this process, arguments based on authority are no longer valid. In order to function, authority must be on the side of freedom, not against it. Here, no one teaches another, nor is anyone self-taught. People teach each other, mediated by the world. As popular educators say, we make the path by walking. Thank you.
Thank you, Aidan. I'm going to remove your spotlight now. Thank you very much, Aidan. That was really interesting provocation on the kind of political positionality of the facilitator and practitioner in this process, and seeing yourself as part of the process too, I think is a really good reflection on that. I'm going to move straight on to share Michelle's provocation. Michelle couldn't be with us this morning live, so she's recorded a short presentation on her reflections on this topic through her project Where We're At. And I'm going to share my screen now. I'm just going to get it up in the right one. Sorry about this. There we are. That's it. Can you all see that from Michelle? Not sure how to make it big on this one. Okay. And here's our hiccup. I'm just going to reload Michelle's presentation so I can share it again. Can you see? Can someone give me a thumbs up? You can see that?
Yeah.
And
I can't make it in person today. Here's my piece about the ethics of using people's stories within theatre. I'm going to draw on my experience of facilitating the collective encounters Where You're At project and talk around the following points. Where does the power lie when making theatre from lived experience? Who has ownership and authorship of the work? Is the story a commodity? What is the problem with the idea of giving voice? What are the issues with verbatim testimony versus dramatic response? I'll start with where does the power lie when making theatre from lived experience? The nature of the project is determined by the facilitator's approach to the brief. For most funded community work, the brief has been set out within the application for the initial funding proposal. This might limit the parameters of the powers of the storyteller. During the creative process, the power continually shifts between the storyteller and the facilitator. The storyteller presents the facts of their story, whilst the facilitator is finding ways to make art with that story. The voice of the project is usually a culmination of the story, the social context of the story, and the artistic interpretation of the story, and the perspective of all the participants. During the process, the original story is likely to be filtered. The voice of the storyteller may become submerged within the voice of the project. So, who has ownership and authorship of the work? Number one, consent needs to be given for the work to be used. Consent regarding how the work should be used would also be the ideal as a second point. But both of these points have their challenges. The storyteller may agree to tell their story for agreed purposes. However, they might not be aware of the full impact of doing this. The storyteller might not have been fully aware of what their story was before they told it. They might not have full control over what is being told. Stories tend to evolve through the telling and reflection process. The storyteller might gain new insights, perspectives, unexpected emotions. Once the floodgates are opened, they might say more than they intended to say. For this reason, consent gained at the start needs to be constantly updated. When the process is organic, as our project was, there's no clear agreement possible, as no one knows exactly what is being agreed to. In this case, the process of negotiation needs to be ongoing. I'd conclude that no one owns the work, because the work is a relationship, and the storyteller should be able to withdraw their story at any point. The work is a collaboration, and so it has no single author, because the story is not solely the storyteller's voice, as mentioned before. It becomes the voice of the project. So the idea of a story as a commodity. The experience of engaging in the story can be bought and sold. The vehicle of the story can be bought and sold, for example, the book or the performance. The story itself is part of the owner. It can be shared, but never bought or sold. And so the problem of the idea of giving voice. Now, a voice can't be given, but the opportunity to hear a voice can be requested. The storyteller is invited to take part in an exploratory journey. But who is really doing the exploration and why? Do we request to use people's voices without our own agenda? The agenda may be to create a platform where people can be heard. I do believe that creating opportunities for people to communicate is important and can be of benefit to both the audience and the storytellers. And I strongly believe that creating these opportunities for people in communities that are generally unheard and misrepresented is necessary. In the Where You're At project, the storytellers were invited to collaborate in the process of making theatre that was based on their experiences of migration. The majority of the text used in the project is verbatim. Initially, information about the participants' experiences was collected. I used a questionnaire to do this, so that we had key themes that we could work with collectively. The questions were about leaving, arriving, circumstances of having told their story, identity, and how they would use their voices. Responses to the questionnaires were merged together, but some stories were so similar that even though they were merged, they didn't really change that much. With the intention of ensuring that the group had as much power as possible, I initially began the sessions by encouraging the group to decide which theme they wanted to work on, which quotes we should use as a stimulus, but it felt as though it was too much of an executive task and that I was meeting my need to empower them rather than their need to take part in a drama workshop. They had already given their stories, so now it was my turn to deliver, and it was a better, more vibrant experience for them if the sessions were planned and structured around the work they had already done. However, I checked that they were in agreement at every stage and aimed to create conditions for a high level of contribution to the creative process. We could never be certain what emphasis would evolve from the raw material that was workshopped. One thing that particularly stood out was that the storyteller might not realise what in their story is shocking or touching, and the story takes on a new light for them when it is told. The experience itself may have made them numb. There were times when the dramatic response to the narrative was overwhelming for the storyteller. The reverse of this is also true. Sometimes important emphasis or nuance was missed. I liken this to technology that can read text out loud without conveying the right emphasis or any emotion. This can be disappointing for the storyteller. Telling your story doesn't always mean that you've been heard. As the work developed, I could sense how all the different parts of the stories might hang together, and the work itself began to dictate what themes and quotes or dialogue would be included. Some people were keen for their stories to be told and to be identified within the work. Others appreciated the fact that their stories were merged around a theme, and their words, whilst present, did not identify them. Some people stepped into their stories, some became actors, and some remained just as storytellers. The facilitator has a duty of care to the storyteller, protecting their identity and their well-being within the creative space. I'll end this with a piece of text from a questionnaire. It's a response to the question, what opportunities have you had to tell your story? I haven't taken opportunities until recently. It isn't until now that I've thought about what it really meant to be an asylum seeker or a refugee. I never really thought of myself as having had a different experience to other people. It just never really occurred to me. My fear was that my identity would be so intricately tied to my past. People with experiences like this can end up getting involuntarily fetishized in a way where people say, "Oh, I'm friends with refugees," or "Oh, look how diverse my friends are." This isn't the way I want people to view me. but I've realised that I can't control how people see me. This has informed my choice to embrace my past in a much more intentional way. People assume I'm talking on behalf of people who don't really speak out for themselves, without realising that I've had these experiences. So this is the end of my comments. I'd be happy to answer any questions via email or at another time. Thank you.
Brilliant. So I'll stop sharing Michelle's provocation there. Sorry, my head went blank for a minute. I think thank you so much for Michelle sending that in for us. I think again, Michelle has talked about herself in this process as a facilitator, and I particularly, that two things stood out, that idea of not giving voice but requesting to hear someone's voice and flipping that on its head, I thought was really interesting provocation. And also her brilliant idea of you want to give as much power over to the group, but actually how much capacity do they have, and are you there as the facilitator with the toolkit to come and hold this process? I thought was really interesting. So thanks again for all our speakers, to Amanda, Aidan and Michelle. They were wonderful provocations on this theme this morning. Myself and Annette, give us a wave, Annette, who is our executive director, will now facilitate a Q&A. Annette, do we have any questions already we can start off with?
We do. We've got a couple in the chat already. So the first one is for Amanda, and it's from our Kathy, which is Amanda. Do you mind me? Would you want me to read it out, Kathy, or would you like to speak?
I'm happy to ask.
Okay.
If I can remember what I said. No. Amanda, thanks very much for your presentation. It's really interesting to see all the projects that you've worked on and to hear what how you've approached things. It was a matter of detail, really. You talked about a project involving consultation with Black men. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how the nature of that and how extensive it was. So how did you go about that consultation, and how many people, or how long did that consultation take? Just a bit more about it, really.
Thanks for the question. Before I get into that, I just want to send an apology to everyone who could not hear me clearly before, particularly the person who said they were hard of hearing. I have sent notes on to Marianne, so hopefully you can catch up with what was said. So picking back up to your question, it really brings back to the thing that Aidan was talking about, which was time and taken, and a little bit of Michelle's points as well. Any consultation within communities, particularly vulnerable communities, takes time. And so in my capacity as a senior leader at Hull Truck Theatre, I began a conversation with fellow artists and communities in 2017. And the work that I'm relating to talking about happened in 2020. So that's how long it took, and it's about trust. It's about evidence of my practice, what I was about, what I kind of experienced, and people could see my work, be involved in the continual conversation. I think it's very interesting when we do share work that we try and encourage the conversations after the work. So there's not enough to kind of mark it and hope people turn up and then maybe they thought of something. I think it's about actually let us talk about the work, good or bad. Let us dig deep into what was shared. So that was a kind of continual link. In 2020, I invited Daniel Ward to make a piece of work about the impact of the pandemic and grief, particularly with Black communities. And he created this beautiful piece called Everything I Own. And he did that. What we did was we invited a small group of around, I think it was 4 up to 7 people around a Zoom table and that was through a regular meeting point once a week, where we shared writing, where we had deep conversations, where we listed music together, and people slowly but surely unpacked their response to the work. That it was a paid opportunity as well, because we wanted to value the time that people were giving. So hopefully that's answered your questions, because I know there's going to be a lot of questions for lots of people, and I want to be as succinct as possible.
That's
Thank
super.
you.
Thanks, Amanda. Does that answer your question, Kathy?
Yes, yeah, lots of food for thought. Thank you. Thanks.
And I think that's a really important practical point, Amanda, is who in the room is getting paid, and how we value that work. And I think a lot of these are just constant questions that we need to be asking ourselves. So the next question's in the chat, and it's from Rona. Rona, would you like me to ask this on your behalf? Where have you gone?
I'd prefer to ask it myself, if that's okay.
Okay, super. Over to you.
Yeah. Can anyone who's not speaking please go on mute, because your voices are really distorted. You sound like Doctor Who dialects at the moment. Questions for Adrian. You were talking a lot about the history of the working classes and the erasing of historical events and the deliberate sort of reforming of education to suit the state. I think this has been going on since time immemorial, more or less, which is how the status quo has been maintained, particularly in Western nations. But in Latin America, they do seem, for the first time ever in Colombia, they've elected a socialist prime minister. So Latin America does seem to be a bit ahead of the curve in terms of what I would call pure democracy, and allowing collective action to sort of rule the day, and allowing the people to have their say and to have more control over their lives and more autonomy, and for socialism to thrive. Whereas we seem to be going backwards, particularly in America, but over here as well. So I guess my question is, do you think that this is likely to continue, going forward? Do you think that we're kind of doomed to repeat the same sort of patterns of coming close to what could possibly be a form of socialism and then being pushed back by the state? Do you think that that might be something that will continue, or do you ever see anything in that respect changing?
It's an enormous question. But it's good to have big questions. So just one comment is, Western governments have always been deeply reactionary, of course. Think back to the legacy of the British Empire. So I think the key word here is pattern. I've been thinking about this, because you were able to put it up earlier. So patterns are very interesting, aren't they? We're in a constant tension between grassroots movements globally attempting to assert ourselves, if I might include myself in that, and those with power and wealth, which is accumulating. They're accumulating power and wealth at an extraordinary rate now, and of course they're not. The people who accumulate that wealth are not going to give it up without a struggle. And again, another thing that's you make a point very well is the perspective that we have on this matters. So in the UK, I personally feel we're very, very far behind in understandings of social justice and social change. Latin America, as you rightly point out, is far more. Well, Latin America is an intellectual and social powerhouse in terms of theories of social change. Let's just say that. However, the governments that you refer to are part of this repeating pattern. The leftist governments in Latin America come and go. So it's what's happening I think, with the people that is important, with grassroots struggle. And there are various ways of looking at this. There's no answer really to this question, because we don't know what's going to happen. We can't predict what's going to happen clearly. But I think one useful concept might be the idea of something called the long revolution. Has anyone come across the idea of the long revolution? So that's a cultural theorist called Raymond Williams, came up with this proposal that changes that we make coalesce over historical time. We shouldn't make the mistake, I think, of thinking that history has a trajectory. I refer to those writers who criticized the Enlightenment earlier, because the Enlightenment is generally in the UK regarded as a good thing, as they used to say in history when I was young. And in fact, the Enlightenment in many ways was a disaster, especially for the global majority of people who were subjugated by empires. And I do believe nowadays we have tools and understandings that may help us break this pattern. And I think those tools have evolved in the global south. And we in the UK have to learn from those. Now, the global south, by the way, I use that carefully. It's a concept, it's not a location. The global south is everywhere, as are the accumulators, if you like, the north, the global north in this kind of shorthand. And just before I finish, it's important to remember the role of creativity in this. Creativity, theatre, all the forms that we've been exploring, storytelling, as Michelle was putting it, they allow us to imagine these changes. So I believe, and it is only a belief, I believe we can break the pattern. If we learn to do this. And I believe that people working at the lowest level, people within communities, are the people that will break this pattern. I don't think leadership of any kind is the answer. So I'm going to finish off with a great quote from Paulo Freire again, which is, "Hope comes from the south." We have to southernize. There's a lovely word, solear. So that's what I would suggest.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that it will come from the grassroots. Thanks for that. Thank you for that comprehensive reply. Thank you.
Thank you, Rona, as well, for the really deep and broad question. And thanks, Aidan, for such a full response. So the next one is from Laura. Laura, would you like to ask this question? Yeah.
Yeah, hello. Hi, everyone. Yeah, just something that I'm grappling a lot with at the moment, actually for a while, are both the benefits, the possible good sides of sharing lived experience with the participants, and then the possible downsides. Aidan, you mentioned tacit socialist, I forget exactly what the phrase was, knowledge. So I'm thinking about both sides. I'd be really interested in discussing that and hearing both the positives and the potential negatives, like what are the obstacles of shared lived experiences as well. Yeah, I'll just open that out to everyone.
Amanda?
It's a shame Michelle's not here because she spoke so well on that.
Yeah.
And so I'm just going to kind of grab from my mind and try and support, I think, the questions. And Laura, that's not about how you delivered it, it's about me putting myself in that position. And the advantage of shared lived experience, I work in circles. And so if you imagine the closer you are to that insight, the quicker you have the shorthands and you can kind of cut through to the next level and not go through all the kind of basics of just who you are, what you're about, and all that stuff. And that's just wonderful when you can move to the next, not having to go through the same patterns as Aidan has said, explaining an experience, a shared experience. You can do the next section, which is where I'm very excited about. So there's that. But I think in terms of art practice, what Michelle was talking about, the difference between art and lived experiences can get in the way of that. I think unpacking, I remember I was very fortunate to be in South Africa in 2010. I attended a theatre festival and I went to Durban for a week in terms of sharing practice. And what I understood was that even the Nelson Mandela story, if told badly, can be very boring. Shocking lesson that I learned. You put all the facts in. Any kind of book or music, we all know this, don't we, in terms of art? If you don't tell it well, no one's listening. And so the minutiae and the detail and the nuances, as Misha was talking about, can get in the way of a well-told story. which gives us the points that we're trying to get across. Why do we tell story? What is the purpose of story? I think that's really interesting in terms of process and product, in terms of commercial and not. So I think, you know, in terms of that shared lived experience, what can get in the way? I think for me, as a dramaturg, working with someone who is from the same or similar, because, you know, we're not a monolith, can be quite an outrageous experience for writers, because they're used to being in a space with dramaturg, unfortunately in this country, don't usually come from my background, working class black female from South London who hung about in Yorkshire. And so I have a lot of tools in my bag because of that, and there's nowhere to hide. So, you know, I think a lot of writers have appreciated that. Like I said before, they haven't had to spend time explaining their language or purpose in life. They have to explain their reason for telling that particular story, which is really exciting as a creative practitioner. So that's my answer. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were trying to get to, but that's my position on it. I'm not sure, Aidan. I think Simon's got his hand up.
Simon, do you want to unmute yourself?
Sorry, yeah, I'm fascinated by this discussion, and you know, our company's got the money from a HLF to tell the story of a whole neighbourhood that we actually work in, and there's massive, I think, considerations for that. But I think as the artist at the centre of it, you know, we do have to make an ethical decision to sort of choose our side and rewrite our history and say, you know, so I need to go into this community, which is the first social housing estate in the country, that we're doing 100 years history of. And so we're going to appropriate the history, but we are going to tell this story of when this was happening, when houses were being built and people were being looked after the war. Now that sounds a bit like wisdom and not wisdom, but I think the wisdom comes from how you approach that task, how you approach making that story, because ethics, the ethics of theatre making is also bound up with the agency that people feel when the project is successful. They feel more able and engaged in the world, more confident, more realizing of themselves as a creative individual. That's got to be our goal, as well as telling a big story with the consent that does change the story of a place. Because, you know, if you can find the consent to change the story with the people whose story you're telling and who are connected to that heritage, then the act of changing the story becomes not just an act of storytelling, but an act of, you know, political agency in the world. And I feel like that's the grand challenge that we face. And the other point I was going to make was that, you know, painting, I always describe making theatre from lived experience, or from history and from what you can ascertain from the lived experience, is like painting with a 9-inch brush. You know, you have to tell people right at the end, right at the beginning, we're not going to say everything. We're not going to tell you every nuance. It's not going to be everything that you might hope it will be. It will just be a sketch for people, because you have to be, as theatre, if you're going to have popular theatre, you've got to be able to grasp it quickly in the same way that you would, you know, a cartoon, a political cartoon, or a punchy phrase or something. It feels like it's got to drop ink in the water somehow, and that's an ethical decision. That's a bit of a ramble, but those are my sharing my thoughts, so I don't have to sit here and bust my gut not saying anything. Thank you.
That's a really good point, which I think Michelle also addressed. It's about continuous consent as well, and who's involved in the conversation around those considerations and that decision making around the ethical questions as well. So I think that's good. Amanda or Aidan, have you got anything to add to that before we move on to the next question?
There's loads of points that have come up, but if I might just add a couple of things to, I think, Laura and Simon's point. So first thing, one thing that always strikes me is, what is my position? So Laura, you were talking, I think, about like, when is it appropriate to share some of your experiences, if I've understood that correctly. So you have to ask yourself, or we have to ask ourselves, I have to ask myself, what is my position? What, you know, my experience is not necessarily going to be relevant in particular contexts that I'm working in. Just because I've had certain experiences that have affected my life in an adverse way does not mean that other people who've had experiences but also have had other kinds of oppressions will in any way feel that I have a right for that experience to resonate with theirs. So I think we have to go in being very clear about our position. in, you know, who we are, where we come from, what kind of education we've had. I come from a new town. You know, Amanda was talking about her roots. So just to be clear about my position, I come from a new town. It's an ambiguous position. I won't go into more, you know, there's no time to unpack this now, but it is always worth, I think, being clear about these positions that we have. I'm obviously also a white educated man. And so going on to what Simon was saying, I think the thing about wisdom and wasdom is what I see happening when people with power get hold of heritage, put up plaques, move the heritage into a museum, take it away from a community that no longer exists, and the act of that, extracting it from that community, actually destroyed the community. In your case, it doesn't sound like that's what's going on anyway, from the way you've described it. But what I think is really interesting is maintaining the relationship with the community for as long as is possible after the work. Continuing dialogues about the work, returning to the work. I think complexity and ambiguity are really important in these things. Can you tell contradictory stories in the piece you're creating? Are there ways, it's like that old idea of Brechtian complex seeing. Can you reflect the nuances of the positions of everyone involved in some way? Is there, if you like, a minority report or opinion? You know, can these things somehow be reconciled, portrayed dramatically, and so on? Anyway, those are some thoughts I had from there. I'll shut up now.
So I'm just aware of time. Amanda, have you got anything to add to that before we move on?
Not on this point, but thank you.
Okay, so we've got 2 more questions, if that's okay, before we have a break, and then we'll move on to the sort of co-creators agenda, while everybody get a chance to explore their questions, their thoughts a little bit deeper. But the first one, or the last one, is from Emily, which I'm going to ask first, which is, in terms of consent, is there a way of gaining consent effectively if working with stories from history? I'm going to put that to you, Amanda, because you gave an example of that.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I'm going back to Michelle's great point, which was about that continual consent. And history is old gossip, isn't it? You have to kind of be really clear. And what it is, that's, you know, you have to be really clear on what you're reading. You're trying to find as much. So for Mary Seacole, she has her own biography. It's about looking at all the different sources of material. You know, you do have to kind of get academic on it and look at what the person's trying to present about themselves. Clearly, we all try to present ourselves, well, not all of us. Some of us will try to present ourselves as perfection, particularly if they're living within a society that's living less so. And that's not helpful for our society today. I think that beautiful reminder of the Brechtian seeing of all of it, it's really important. Looking at the full person. To check your own agenda, as Aidan has said, and then look at that person's experience within the time they were living. I think in terms of gaining consent, I think there has to be some form of recognition that we know what we know at this point, and everything changes, just as we are finding out in terms of the science that we're finding out in terms of the stars above us. We know what we know at this point because of the information that we have access to, but anything can change, and forgiving ourselves about that, really. I think that's one of the things that I find with my own practice, but being very clear and very explicit about why it's this person, why I want to kind of talk about this particular moment and how it impacts on now.
That's super. Thank you, Amanda. Aidan, do you have anything to add? If not, we're just going to address Clara's final question.
One thing did occur to me, which was Amanda spoke about the need to talk to relatives. So if you're dealing with recent history and there are living relatives of the people whom you're centering in your story, then you must, you know, that's a must, isn't it? If anyone watched Sherwood recently, I recommend that, by the way. It's a stunning bit of drama. But there was a really interesting article about how the writer worked with relatives, not all of whom approved of the piece, by the way. And he worked with, I mean, obviously they're living people, but there were obviously some, you know, people who were no longer alive. So it's very complex.
Super, thank you. And finally from Clara. Clara, do you want to put your mic on?
Hi everyone. I've asked 2 questions and I don't know what one's maybe the most appropriate right now. So I don't know if it's worth asking both, and then people can maybe just choose the one that's best. Is that okay?
Which one do you want to best hive mind from the presenters, really? Which one's
so difficult, because in terms of legality, I've worked in this field for sort of 15 years, and in light of GDPR, things are changing, and our role as theatre makers is changing as a result of that. And maybe that's a conversation for a breakout space, I'm not sure. But another one is really understand, oh, excellent, thanks, Marianne. Another one really is about our duty of care. And I think because we're becoming so more aware of individuals' well-being, particularly when we're working with vulnerable individuals, our job, as we know, is to sort of work with these individuals to tell their story and sort of frame that artistically. But we're becoming more and more aware of trauma and what trauma triggers are for people, and how do we effectively hold that space for when people have these new realizations or new emotions come to the forefront of that experience. And then how do we know from a psychological perspective what then can be, now I can't remember the correct terminology here, so do forgive me, but then the knock-on effect of triggers for other people. So how do we hold that space when we don't have a psychologist, therapist, counsellor in the room to do that effectively? And also when budgets don't allow for that, because more often than not, the funder doesn't necessarily think about that aspect in terms of duty of care. So any experiences that you have on that would be really appreciated. Thank you.
I'll grab this one. I'm going to go with duty of care and leave GDPR for another point. So in terms of the economics, in 2007, I'm talking about public sector making work now. That's the area I'm talking about. What happened was the whole credit crunch lie. And so we went to a place of funding and getting to the casts went to 8, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, could afford to produce one person on the stage to tell their story. It then became a habit, and people could not afford writers. So then they used the opportunity to tell their own story, to be the writer, the performer, the producer, the whole shebang. It created an extraordinary body of work, but damaged artists in that work, because what we didn't think about was the absolute thing that you just talked about, which is the care. Now, what happened is the nation learned about all sorts of experiences, and so they gained and benefited from that. And some people, my youngest son calls it flagellation. Some people went to those spaces to feel some form of exoneration. They felt some form of relief, that they could go through the pain of that person's, for that moment in time, an hour and a half, and then go home. So it was a really unholy alliance. Behaviours, and they wanted more and more and more from that individual artist, so it became a pattern. I think what we are in now, because we were in crisis before the pandemic with that kind of work, is recognition of a mental health crisis within our creative industry, and looking at actually plugging in that kind of support within the budget and the practice. That we're in that place where we have to accept where we are, and no longer accept the pain of people's art as a way of some blood and circus in it. For me, in terms of my practice, I have always been aware of the concerns of people's individual mental health, because I'm a black working class woman living in all sorts of experiences and seeing how people are living. And so if you've had less opportunities to tell your stories, people in my rehearsal room take the first 3 days to do that, then we get to the art. And I have to plan for that. It gets better and easier because people get used to my practice, and so I place partnerships with counselling teams. Inc. Arts recognised the counselling need, and so I am, as a director and a writer and producer, no longer accepting that part of that role. There's a duty of care, it's absolutely paramount, but I am not a trained counsellor. And so in the space that we create, we allow for that space to be needed outside of our rehearsal rooms, personal responsibility, and taking care for us to make the work. That's not neglecting people anyway. It's been recognising what we're there and what our purpose is. So hopefully that's answered the question as quickly as we've got.
That's super. Thank you, Amanda. I think we need to start asking funders for that money as well. Aidan, I know you'll have something to say about this as well.
Yeah, well, I firstly agree with everything Amanda said there. I think it's worth remembering that the country as a whole and the world as a whole are experiencing a mental health crisis, but also that certain kinds of people are experiencing this additionally through cultural trauma as well. So there is individual trauma, but there is also the collective trauma that comes from being the kind of person who is being targeted by the state for reasons that I'm sure people are aware of, or because of histories to do with slave trafficking, or we had a discussion in a workshop recently about Irish history in this context. So there is a lot. This is a huge issue. We can't go into it all now, but there's a couple of things that are worth mentioning. Clara, you couldn't remember a term, and I think the term you may be looking for is vicarious trauma, when one person's trauma influences and impacts on somebody else's experiences and creates trauma in that person. The other thing that's worth mentioning is this is such a big topic that Collective Encounters run regular trauma-informed practice training. I run those with a psychotherapist. They don't provide all the answers, but they do provide a space to consider the issues that you've brought up here. We aren't therapists. It's a really important point that Amanda made. We're absolutely not therapists. We engage in creative work. It's a different sphere, isn't it? It's a different language, if you like, different space. But we do have a duty of care. So I think, yes, those are, those are things that need to be thoroughly built into projects. And that we also have a responsibility to learn about them ourselves, to work in ways that don't reinforce these experiences for people, and to know what to do on a sort of first aid basis. And that's partly what our trauma-informed practice workshops are aimed at. The whole topic of cultural trauma is much wider, and I think is really important. And there are lots of resources on that, but that's information that we can provide in another way, and signpost you to, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we'll wrap up the kind of Q&A here, but thank you so much for those questions and answers. And on the trauma-informed practice training, we're looking to schedule another in September, I think. So keep an eye out for that. They're really good sessions. And like Aidan said, a really good space to just kind of consider these issues. So I just wanted to say thank you again to Amanda and Aidan and Michelle for your provocations. They were really fabulous, and I can tell have really got people thinking. What we're going to do now is I'm just going to introduce the idea of the open space so that we can start thinking about it. Then we'll have a break and input the agenda and go from there. So thank you very much for the first half. We're going